Revelation is an unfamiliar organization of thought. Now, Revelation's unfamiliar on a multitude of levels, from its symbolism to its sources in the Old Testament to its calls on our life. But when it comes to the structure of Revelation, honestly, it's just unfamiliar, primarily because of the way that we think. See, I usually always tease my students when it comes to the structure. I say, listen, if I was really a mean professor, what I would make you do is outline this book. Because outlining the book of Revelation, like with Roman numeral 1 and then A and B, is almost impossible. Because the way that it organizes its thought is not the way in which we normally think. Normally, in the Western world, we think progressively or progression. We move progressively from point A to point B to point C, and then we land on our key point, point D. We think linearly. A equals B, or the sequence of events. It's probably where some of our assumptions about the book even comes from, is that we think linearly and we think that the book itself is doing the same thing that we are doing. Here's the problem. John wasn't a Westerner. John was a Jew. And Jews do not think in progression. Jews think cyclically. As a matter of fact, a lot of times the Jew's point will maybe be point D, but he'll actually begin with point A and then move to point B and then move to point C, and then once he gets to point D, he's not done. He begins and he restates point D a little different, restates point C and then B and then A. We actually call this, there's a fancy word for this, and it's recapitulation. Recapitulation. I can do that. Recapitulation basically means this. It is the retelling of the same events from a different perspective, oftentimes involving intensification. I know the word can seem intimidating, but all you need to do is to take the first 5 letters and it'll just kind of give you an opportunity to relax a bit. It's a recap. Think about a newscast. When you're watching a newscast and you're halfway through, a lot of times they'll say, let's recap the news. And they will retell the news, the same events that they've already told, but this time with a different purpose. The purpose is brevity, just to catch you up. Not all the details that they gave you earlier, but smaller ones. A recapitulation, a recap. And Jews think like this. Matter of fact, the book of Revelation is organized like this, and another word outside of recapitulation is cyclically. As a matter of fact, let me replot these points and show you where the cycle or where the circle begins to emerge. If point D is his key point, then he'll begin at point A, move to point B, then to point C, summarize point D, C, B, and then A. Do you see it? It's a circle. This is the reason why you see in the book of Revelation the world ending over and over and over and over again. Remember, it ends 7 times. And the number 7 is a number of completion. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that whenever we see the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, that they each come to the end of the world. And that in between the 6th and the 7th seal and the 7th trumpet and the 6th and the 7th bowl, there's an interlude. And all of this interlocking structure is constantly moving back and forth in time to intensify its key points. But it is not going A to B to C to D. It's going cyclically. So as a result, since this is such an unfamiliar organization of thoughts, we need some key tips or some key tools to be able to identify the point of revelation outside of merely plotting it on a line. One of the things I would tell you to do is to look for dialogue. Turn to Revelation chapter 19, verse 10. Dialogue, in the midst of all of this movement, in the midst of all these cycles, dialogue a lot of times can focus your attention on the key point of the movement. So here we have the fall of Babylon in chapter 18, and heaven celebrated at the beginning of 19 with the unveiling of the bride of Christ in 19 verse 8. And then comes verse 10. At this, I, speaking of John, John, fell at the angel's feet to worship him. But he said to me, don't do that. I'm a fellow servant with you and with your brothers and sisters who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God. We do this all the time. And frankly, in the first century, it was a pretty big temptation too. You get so overwhelmed with what it is that you see and we're just beings that are made to worship, and we just worship the first thing that's in front of us. The first thing that catches our eye, the thing that enamors us the most, whether it be celebrities or cars or the city of Rome. And John here makes a similar mistake where he's so overwhelmed with the vision that he worships an angel. And the angel says, whoa, worship God. Worship God alone. Nothing else comes before Him. Nothing else should obstruct this. You worship God alone. We need to pay attention to the dialogue. Because in the midst of all of these cycles moving, in the midst of these recapitulations, the dialogue clarifies the central point. The dialogue helps for us to understand what it is that John is trying to say. There is also another point of structure I'd like to make. Scholars all agree that something unique happens in chapter 12. You see, chapters 4, really all the way up through chapter 8, you have the 7 seals. And then you get in chapters 8, all the way up through chapter 11, you have the 7 trumpets. You would think that the very next thing to follow, chapter 11, chapter 12, would be the 7 bowls. I mean, there are 3 sets of 7. They all go to the end of the world. They all have interludes. They parallel. But instead of going to the 7 trumpets, in chapter 12, we are introduced in the foreground to an image that has been in the background the whole time. The image of Satan. I mean, in chapter 12, we see him as the great red dragon in verse 3, trying to devour the baby. Do you remember? And Satan comes on the scene, and he very powerfully is depicted as having sovereignty and authority. And he calls forth, in chapter 13, he calls forth 2 helpers. The first one is the beast from the sea, and the second one is the beast from the earth. And their ministries are fascinating because whenever you compare these 3 entities, they start to parody or look a lot like another Trinity or another tripartite group of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. As a matter of fact, the way that Satan is described with his sovereignty parallels the one seated on the throne. As a matter of fact, the beast from the sea, he's even wounded in the head, and then he comes back to life, kind of, which sounds pretty familiar, a resurrection. And even the beast from the earth, his entire ministry is to point the worship back to the other two entities, even breathing life into an idol, sounding an awful lot like the breath of life known as the Holy Spirit. What you have in chapter 12 and then in chapter 13 is the unveiling of an unholy Trinity. An unholy Trinity that is parodying the Holy Trinity. And both of them also have one other key aspect. Both of them have a people. In chapter 14, for the very first time, we have Babylon emerges on the scene. Babylon comes. Matter of fact, the angel even cries out, "Fallen is Babylon," proclaiming its destruction even before it's destroyed. But Babylon is a manifestation of the will of the unholy Trinity on earth. All that Satan is trying to accomplish, all of his mission, all of his ministry is fed into this unholy city, this unholy people. But the Holy Trinity has a parallel people as well. In Revelation, it also has the name of a city, and the name is the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem. See, in the book of Revelation, we have a tale of 2 cities, but it's not even just a tale of 2 cities. It's also a tale of 2 women. Because in chapter 17, this Babylon figure is personified as a prostitute. And in chapter 19, we see the New Jerusalem personified as the bride of Christ. And this is what all of this insertion into the structure is trying to tell us. In Revelation, worship is war. In Revelation, who you worship should be as obvious as it being stamped on your forehead, and we'll talk about that later. In Revelation, who you bow your knee to dictates your actions, dictates what side of the battle you are on in this war. Which city do you belong to? Which woman are you? Which Trinity do you follow? There's something also fascinating that occurs in chapter 12. Remember, Jews think cyclically. They think in cycles. They are recapitulating. And in chapter 12, we see Satan emerge in the foreground. He's been in the background, but now he comes to the foreground. Chapter 13, you see the two beasts. They come on the scene. In chapter 14, you see Babylon. Now this is what's interesting. Remember our circle at the beginning. In chapters 17 through 18, you see the destruction of Babylon. In chapter 19, you could probably guess it, you see the destruction of the two beasts. And in chapter 20, we finally see the destruction of Satan. Here's why this is important. They are introduced and then they are disposed of in reverse order. They are introduced and disposed of in reverse order. If I would rearrange this, it would look like a circle because they're thinking cyclically. And their key point is right here in the middle. Now, why would the key point of all of Revelation center on Babylon and not on Satan or not on the two beasts? Because if you're a Christian in Asia Minor and you're in the conflict at the end of the first century, the unholy trinity, yes, is definitely attacking you. But what you see is this. What you see is Babylon. What you see is Rome. What you see is the emperor and his people crushing you physically and non-physically. What you are in directly conflict, what your eyes can see is this. But what Revelation structure tries to tell you is, but this is not all that is the story. For the story is much bigger. And the story is much greater. For this is an antagonist we've been fighting since Genesis 3. For this story, while it contains you, is bigger than you. And that is both comforting and overwhelming. The structure of Revelation says this. There is a war. Who are you worshiping?